Good morning. My name's Andy Dunning. I'm the pastor at University Park United Methodist Church. It is Sunday morning, October 1st, and I'm making this recording not from the church, but rather from my home office in the basement of my house. The reason I'm recording from home is that this morning I tested positive for COVID, so obviously I'm staying home so I don't infect anyone else. I really do appreciate the text messages and the emails that some of you from the congregation have sent to check in on me. I feel fine except for a stuffy nose, and thankfully my wife Gayla has tested negative so far. I really hope that continues. So I wanted to make this recording just to fill you in on some of the things that we'll be focusing on in church during the month of October. Throughout the month of October, I'm going to be asking all of us to think through our financial commitments to this ministry that we share in 2024. Now, please don't rush for the door or rush to shut off the video. I'm not trying to get in your pockets, at least, not yet, but I do think it's important each year to spend some time asking what our congregation has to offer in God's service to each other and to the world beyond the walls of our church, and asking ourselves how we can support that mission and be part of it in the coming 12 months. So this month in church, I'll be preaching a sermon series called Together, which focuses on church community. I know that this is probably not the way we usually think of church, but I believe that Christianity got its start as a spiritually grounded, community-based, nonviolent resistance movement to the Roman Empire, rooted in the Jewish conviction that we serve the one living and true God who called us then, and I believe calls us now, to form a life-giving alternative to the forces of death that surround us. Now, I know that sounds like a strong statement, and if you want to talk about it, I'm happy to do so. Probably best to wait until after I'm in the office. But today, I want to talk about the importance of church community in being a life-giving response to one of those harmful forces in our society, and that is widespread isolation and loneliness. The New York Times reporter Nicholas Kristof has recently published a series of articles on factors that leave large numbers of Americans behind in economic prosperity and in quality of life. In one of those articles, Kristof wrote that more than 1/4 of the children who rode the number 6 school bus with me in Yamhill, Oregon, have died from drugs, alcohol, suicide, and other deaths of despair. More than 25% of those kids that Kristof knew going to school on that bus are gone. And as he recognizes in that article, these deaths that are now being called deaths of despair, deaths from addiction or suicide or careless self-harm, all of these things are linked to social isolation and loneliness. Kristof raises some pretty tough statistics, and maybe you've already heard them. He points to research that shows that loneliness is statistically linked to strokes, to heart disease, to dementia, to inflammation, to suicide. Studies of comparable death rates show that loneliness is as deadly as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's more lethal than consuming 6 alcoholic drinks per day. In surveys of thousands of people, a majority of Americans report experiencing loneliness. They don't have friends, they're not connected, they feel left out. And if you're drawing a mental line between the estranged loners who stoke up their rage on the internet and then shoot up schools and shopping centers, well, I don't think that connection is wrong. Now, it would be natural to assume that loneliness and these things called deaths of despair are more common in marginalized groups and among poor people. But it turns out that's not true. Loneliness and isolation affect everyone. But the one common element seems to be not poverty or wealth or race or ethnic background, but rather the belief that things will not get better. That is to say, the one common element among those who suffer most from loneliness and from the consequent deaths of despair that loneliness brings is not economics or ethnicity, it's hopelessness. Now, In that article, Christoph shares a striking observation. He points out that during the Great Depression of the 1930s, when people had every reason to feel hopeless, mortality rates actually went down. He writes, "Why didn't we have more deaths of despair in the 1930s? I think it's in part because in the 1930s, there were community institutions, churches, men's clubs, women's associations, bridge clubs, bowling leagues, extended families that buffered the pain and humiliation of unemployment and economic distress." That's a quote from Christoph. Churches and all the other community institutions became places where people could go to feel supported and loved and like they belonged. They became a place where people could find hope in the knowledge that whatever came, they were not alone. Now, maybe you're familiar with the biblical book of Job. In our worship service this morning at church, that a passage from the 2nd chapter was read. Job is a story about a man who by any standards is one of the best people around, living one of the best lives around. He has everything he could possibly want. He has a wonderful family. He worships God and has a great relationship with God, but suddenly he loses everything. His possessions are gone. His family is killed. His livestock is taken from him. His land is blighted. And at the end of the book's 2nd chapter, Job has gone from having everything anyone could ever want to being one of the most pathetic figures in all of literature. A lonely, disfigured, diseased man sitting on a pile of rubble and ash that used to be his house, scratching his open sores with a broken piece of pottery. The book of Job raises questions we probably all asked at one time or another. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why does life seem so unfair? Is it really true that God rewards the righteous? Is it really true that God protects anyone from anything? Does the universe even make sense? And how can we be present for each other in those times when it doesn't? Most of the book of Job is a conversation between Job and 3 of his friends who've come to be with him in his time of trouble. Eventually, at the end, God speaks as well. And in the end, God is not happy with Job's friends because all they have offered him is their pious Sunday school answers about why all this happened, explaining God and telling Job he has no right to question or be pained or complain. In the end of the book, God says to Job's friends, "My anger is kindled against you because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." But before that in the book, in fact, in the 2nd chapter, there is this moment before the friends give him all their theological explanations and starts explaining God and scolding him. There is this moment when they do something right. There's Job sitting all alone in his grief, his clothes torn, covered in dust and ashes. And his friends see him and they begin to weep. They tear their own clothes. They put dust on themselves. And for 7 days, they sit down with him and they say nothing at all. Before they give in to their anxiety and their desire to somehow make it all make sense, at first, they just join him. They just sit down with him in silence and join him where he is. Their presence says everything that needs to be said. I like to think that in that book, Job meets God twice. Of course, he meets God at the end when God speaks to him, this thundering, magnificent voice out of a powerful storm. But I also like to think that maybe Job meets God when his 3 friends sit down with him in silence. When they sit with him in a presence that, to use James Finley's phrase, neither invades him nor abandons him, but simply joins him where he is. Some of you might know the work of Parker Palmer. Our former pastor, Paul Kotke, introduced me to Palmer's writing more than 20 years ago. In one of his books, Palmer writes about his own struggle with clinical depression. Talking about that period of depression, or actually those periods, there were 2 of them for him, talking about his depression in a radio interview, Palmer said that when he first became depressed, he was ashamed. He wanted to hide it. He was known by then as a teacher and a spiritual writer. He figured if people knew that he was facing depression, they would see him as a fake, a failure, someone who was incapable of picking up on his own wisdom and insights and using them for his own betterment. But after his episodes of depression, Palmer realized that he had been thinking about spiritual life all wrong. He said, I had embraced a form of Christian faith devoted less to the experience of God than to abstractions about God, a fact that now baffles me. How did so many disembodied concepts emerge from a religious tradition whose central commitment is to Jesus of Nazareth, who we call the Word become flesh? In that radio interview, Palmer said, I had folks coming to me who wanted to be helpful, and sadly, most of them were not. These were people who would say to me, gosh, Parker, why are you sitting in here being depressed? It's a beautiful day outside. Go outside, feel the sunshine, smell the flowers. And that, of course, Palmer said, that leaves a depressed person feeling even more depressed, because while you know intellectually that it's sunny out and the flowers are lovely and fragrant, you can't really feel any of that in your body. So you're left more depressed by this good advice to get out and enjoy the day. And then, he said, then other people would come and say something like, gosh, Parker, why are you depressed? You're such a good person. You've helped so many people. You're so successful. You've written so much so well. And that, he said, that would leave me feeling even more depressed. Because then I would feel, if they really knew what a schmuck I was, they would cast me into the darkness, where I already am. But then Palmer said this. He said, there was this one friend who came to me after asking permission to do so every afternoon about 4 o'clock. He sat me down in a chair in the living room. He took off my shoes and socks and massaged my feet. He hardly ever said anything. He was a Quaker elder. Out of his intuitive sense, from time to time, he would say a very brief word to me, something like, I can feel your struggle today. Or farther down the road, I feel that you're a little stronger at this moment, and I'm glad for that. But beyond that, he would hardly say anything. What he mainly did for me, Palmer said, what he mainly did for me was to be willing to be present with me in my suffering. He just hung in with me in this very quiet, very simple, very tactile way. It became for me a kind of metaphor of the kind of community that we need to extend to people who are suffering in this way, which is a community that is neither invasive of the mystery nor evasive of the suffering, but rather is willing to hold people in a sacred space of relationship where somehow this person who's on the dark side of the moon can get a little confidence that they might be able to come around to the other side. See, we'll be reflecting in October about church community, because I believe that we, here in this church, here at University Park United Methodist Church, I believe that we are called to be that community. Not just for people struggling through depression, although certainly that, but for everyone. Because sooner or later, all of us go through loneliness and isolation. All of us get those feelings like we can't possibly be what the world expects or needs, like we're not enough no matter how we try. In those times, and in our most joyous and celebratory moments, we need people to be with us in our lives. We need people to do life with. I think that we here at University Park United Methodist Church are called to be part of the antidote to that epidemic of loneliness, to those deaths of despair that we hear so much about. I think that all of us need a holy community that can remind us that God is to be found when we are together. God is to be found when we gather, not because we know the answers or can offer the correct explanations, but just because we join each other right where we are. And because where we are is always, always right where God is. If you'd like to talk about anything I've said today, if you want to just get hold of me and learn more about our stewardship campaign for this year, feel free to give me a call at the office or email me or text me. I will look forward to talking to you, and at least next Sunday I will be through with my period of quarantine. So hopefully I'll see you in person then. Have a great week.